1941. The island of Crete was under attack. In the largest airborne assault ever launched, elite German paratroopers spearheaded the invasion. Soon 30,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers were trapped. The call went out for a highly unorthodox unit, trained to carry out daring raids by land or sea. The Commandos. Their leader, Colonel Robert Laycock, cavalry officer and future head of Special Forces.
He was up for the challenge, above all, an action man. He was a good leader.
Alongside him, an unusual intelligence officer, the author Evelyn Waugh, better known for his sharp wit than his military prowess.
I think he displayed a surprising amount of courage for what one would expect from him.
What they thought would be a classic commando raid to capture an airfield would turn into something entirely different when they arrived on Crete.
The scene was a Dantesque-like scene. The whole place reeked of death and defeat. If one wanted to paint a picture of hell, that was just about it.
The commandos now found themselves with no heavy weapons, fighting a desperate rearguard action against Hitler's crack mountain troops. Could Laycock's lightly armed force hold the line, allowing thousands of soldiers to escape? Or would they be overrun and captured? In April 1941, Germany and its allies invaded Greece. In a devastating campaign, they pushed rapidly through the mountainous terrain. Within just 3 weeks, Greece had fallen. The 50,000 British and Commonwealth troops stationed there had no choice but to evacuate. They left at breakneck speed, leaving behind their heavy weapons, destroying anything they thought might be of use to the enemy. Most of the troops were shipped off to Egypt, the headquarters for British forces in North Africa. But by now, the Germans were selecting their next target, the island of Crete. Just 160 miles long and 35 miles wide, Crete sits only 400 miles north of Egypt. This made it of vital strategic importance. If Crete fell, then the British forces in North Africa would be sitting ducks for German aircraft.
In 1941, the strategic importance of Crete was it was almost like an aircraft carrier in the middle of the eastern Mediterranean. While the Germans could bomb Alexandria from Greece and the Balkans, by having Crete, they could up that bombing rate and give them increased fighter cover.
Until now, there had been just a small garrison defending Crete, along with a few RAF fighters. But Winston Churchill was determined the island would be held at all costs. But who could hold it? Most British troops in North Africa were already engaged in the fight of their lives. holding off the German General Rommel's Afrika Korps. The only forces available were the evacuees from Greece. Some 25,000 men, half of them Australians and New Zealanders, were diverted to defend Crete. It was a desperate move. Having abandoned most of their equipment, they were poorly armed.
When the evacuees started to arrive, many of them came in with, if they were lucky, a personal weapon, others literally just the clothes they stood up in.
And even when they did have weapons, they were often lacking kit needed to operate them effectively.
In one case, a battery had no sights, and so they made it up out of bubble gum and matchsticks. So it was really sort of a Heath Robinson type affair.
In early May, the Luftwaffe struck, softening up Crete's defenses with 2 weeks of intensive bombing. Once they had air supremacy, on the morning of the 20th of May, the sky over northern Crete turned black, with German planes carrying paratroopers. General Freiberg, the officer commanding the defenders of Crete, appeared unruffled.
As he was eating his breakfast, you could feel the throb of aircraft coming, and he grunted into his cornflakes, dead on time. And he knew that it was going to be heavy.
It was the largest airborne assault that had ever been launched. But Freiberg's men resisted heroically.
In many cases, groups of paratroopers dropped into orchards and olive groves and in open ground, and there they were hunted down by small groups of New Zealanders.
Nearly 2,000 Germans were killed on the first day. But eventually, German firepower told. Just 15 miles from British headquarters at Suda Bay, they seized the key airfield of Maleme. The Germans could now bring in heavily armed reinforcements. It was a crucial stage in the battle. If the British were to hold Crete, they had to retake Maleme.
Across the bay, General Freiberg from his headquarters could see the JUs coming in, landing, taking off, and another lot coming in. So he knew that the vital air bridge into Crete was at Maleme, and he requested that Maleme be dealt with.
But who could take on the Germans? It just so happened that 400 miles away in Egypt, the British seemed to have both the perfect force and the perfect commander for the job. Robert Laycock and the Commandos. Robert Edward Laycock had it all. Handsome, dashing, well-connected. He'd been born into Britain's military aristocracy. As the eldest son of a brigadier general, he had followed the well-trodden path of the elite. From the playing fields of Eton College, through officer training at Sandhurst, to a commission in one of Britain's grandest regiments, the Royal Horse Guards. Like many soldiers, he had spent the early years of the war kicking his heels in frustration. Britain stood alone, behind the English Channel, undefeated, but not strong enough to take the fight to the Germans. But then, Laycock received a call from a famous relative. The film star, David Niven. Niven had left Hollywood and returned to fight for his country. His wife was distantly related to Laycock. Niven had heard that Churchill was planning an unconventional force and wondered whether it might appeal to his friend. That force was the Commandos. Their task, to launch short, sharp raids, harassing the enemy. Back then, it was about all Britain was capable of doing. In those early days, the basis for selection was still quite vague. Sergeant James Dunning was one of those who answered the call.
The notice appeared in orders, volunteers wanted for special service, and didn't say exactly what, but then it gave some criteria for the volunteers: able to drive, able to swim, prepared to travel in a submarine, and prepared to volunteer for parachuting. I thought, well, it's just a job.
Above all, the Commandos wanted men eager for action and adventure. Robert Laycock was immediately accepted, promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, and put in charge of No. 8 Commando. He was a born leader.
He had a terrific face, a face of a gentleman boxer, and he was rugged but good looking and very fit, always looked very fit.
Each commando unit had about 500 men, led by 10 troop leaders. Laycock's first task was to recruit these officers, and he had strong ideas on selection.
He said, "Be more careful than choosing a wife, and don't tolerate any creepers." And that was pretty sound advice.
So he turned to his high-living society friends in Britain's grandest regiments. Among them, an old family friend. Winston's son, Randolph Churchill. Commando training then began in earnest. It was a radical change from the Army's traditional PE in white shorts and plimsolls.
And we in the Commandos, the CO said, "That's ridiculous. What are you getting fit for? Not to play rugby or football or some very nice sport. You're getting fit to fight. So you do your PE in your battle dress. And you take your weapons with you. And if necessary, you pack. And you don't need dumbbells and things like that. You've got your rifle to do rifle exercises. And that brought in the concept of obstacle courses.
By the autumn of 1940, the Commandos were ordered to train for large-scale amphibious raids. The rugged west coast of Scotland became their practice ground for future operations in the Mediterranean. News of Laycock's supposedly secret commando unit soon reached another member of the smart London set. Evelyn Waugh was one of his generation's most successful authors. Already famous for a series of bitingly satirical novels. At the age of 36, he had decided to volunteer for the army. But he couldn't resist poking fun, as one of his fellow officers recalls.
He liked embarrassing the senior officers. I remember at one mess night, there was a rather pompous old dugout of full colonel, probably brought back for the war, a very senior officer. And I overheard War saying, "Wouldn't you agree, sir, that it is a new decree in the Romanian army that no one beneath the rank of major may now use lipstick?" And of course the old boy just didn't know how to take a remark like that.
Having negotiated a transfer to the commandos, War set off for Scotland. He found Laycock and his men both training and playing hard.
The smart set drink a very great deal, play cards for high figures, dine nightly in Glasgow, and telephone to their trainers endlessly.
War was soon making himself at home.
Setting out drunk for one of the night operations, I fell down and cut my lip. But no one thought the worse of me for this accident.
Despite the partying, a serious fighting force was also emerging. But they were now desperate for combat.
So these were the kind of men who joined for action. They didn't want to be sitting doing the same old exercise over and over again. They wanted action.
Finally, in January 1941, the order came through to embark for Egypt. Lieutenant Colonel Laycock was promoted and put in charge of 3 commando units, over 1,500 men. And Evelyn Waugh travelled with him as his intelligence officer. In North Africa, Laycock's commandos were renamed Lay Force. There, they were merged with another unit, the Middle East Commandos, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Young, a former intelligence officer and Royal Engineer. His commando unit had been formed at the same time as the British, but unlike them, had seen plenty of action in the course of a year, fighting the Italians in the Mediterranean and East Africa. But if Laycock hoped he was now going to see some action, at first it seemed he was wrong. Apart from one abortive mission, he and his troops simply had to sit back and take in the delights of Egypt.
Here in the old bazaars of Cairo, there's 101 things symbolic of the East, and which to some of the folks at home will prove the most novel presents they've ever received. But what's this? Something which to those at home will be as precious as water in the desert was to these lads. Silk stockings.
But then, on May the 22nd, the news came through that Crete needed an attack force to seize the airfield at Malemi. It was just the kind of job the commandos had been trained for. Laycock's initial plan was simple. His men would sail to the British-held port of Suda Bay on the north coast of the island. From there, they would launch an attack on Malemi airfield, just 15 miles away. The next day, Laycock and around 800 of his men arrived in the port of Alexandria, expecting to catch a ship to take them on the 14-hour journey to Crete. But at the last minute, the troop carriers allotted to them were thought too vulnerable to air attack, so they had to hunt around for alternatives.
Eventually, only about 200, just over half of a battalion, managed to get onto a minesweeper, HMS Abdeel, and they set off to Suda Bay that day.
Laycock and Young were left behind in Alexandria, along with the remaining 600 commandos. It was the first of a series of blows that would utterly change the nature of their mission, from assault into narrow escape. Finally, 18 hours later, suitable vessels were found. One of their transports was the Australian destroyer HMAS Nizam. Midshipman Adrian Holloway was just 18 at the time.
They were unlike troops that I had ever seen. They were festooned with weapons, and their faces were covered with balaclavas, even in the heat. And under the balaclavas, they had blackened faces, and I felt that all they needed were cutlasses. They looked a formidable fighting force. Somebody whispered to me, "They're even deserters from the Foreign Legion." And I was reminded of the remark of the Duke of Wellington, "I don't know what they do to the enemy, but by God, sir, they frighten me."
But then, out at sea, Laycock ran into something he had not anticipated.
At first, the weather was delightful, rather like a Mediterranean cruise, and they were scattered around the iron deck and enjoying it. But then later on, at about 9 o'clock, the wind got up. And it really was the most frightful gale. It was force 9. Force 12 on the Beaufort scale is the hurricane. And the ship began to roll and pitch, and vomit mixed with salt water. It became clear that the mission would have to be abandoned. We made our way back to Alexandria. 24 hours, really, we lost.
The next morning, the commandos set out for Crete again, but they were now 2 days late, and events had taken place on the island that had changed everything. The Germans had used their control of Malemi airfield to bring in thousands of reinforcements. They were now forcing their way east, under the cover of a massive aerial bombardment. In just 2 days, they pushed the front line to within a few miles of British headquarters at Suda Bay, just where Laycock's men were heading. When Laycock's ships arrived that night, they encountered the first of a series of shocks.
The scene in Suda Bay was a Dantesque-like scene. Ships were burning, they were gurgling as they went down, there was smoke everywhere, and literally the whole place reeked of death and defeat. That was perfectly frightful, and if one wanted to paint a picture of hell, that was just about it. There were flashes in the mountains surrounding the bay, and it was quite obvious we were in the front line.
To save their ships, the Navy ordered Layforce to disembark in rapid time. In the rush, they could only take the ammunition and rations they could carry by hand, and were forced to leave behind vital communications equipment. And there was even worse news. Evelyn Waugh recalls the arrival of a distraught officer.
He was wearing shorts and a greatcoat and could not speak intelligibly on account of weariness and panic. "My God, it's hell," he said. "We're pulling out."
Crete, the island they had come to rescue, was being abandoned. It seemed the commandos' mission was over before it had even begun. General Freyberg soon confirmed the bad news.
as they pulled out of the dock area into that confusion of withdrawing troops, they bumped into General Freyberg. And General Freyberg said, there's no point in attacking Mallarmé anymore, we're withdrawing. He said, find Major General Weston, he is conducting withdrawal, and he will give you orders.
Weston was the Royal Marines officer whose men had been defending Souda Bay.
They're retreating, sir.
When Laycock and War met him, he gave them more bad news. Not only was Crete being abandoned, but Layforce would be tasked with covering the retreat. Their job would be to hold off some 18,000 Germans, while over 20,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers, trapped in western Crete, would have to march 35 miles over rough terrain, crossing Crete's White Mountains to the small fishing village of Sfakia on the south side of the island. From there, they could be evacuated by the Royal Navy and taken to safety in Egypt. But holding the Germans at bay was something for which Laycock and his men were utterly ill-equipped. Normally, to fight a successful rearguard action, you would need heavy weapons and air support. Layforce had only light machine guns and rifles. But Robert Laycock and his comrade in arms, Lieutenant Colonel George Young, rose to the challenge.
These are not the kind of men who are going to be fazed by a small change of plan, or even a big one, come to that.
And they would not be fighting alone. Weston was also deploying his Royal Marines and units from the Australian and New Zealand forces. The plan for the rearguard was to use a series of blocking positions along the escape route. As the Germans advanced, the troops facing them in the front-line position would hold on as long as possible, then withdraw, moving back to the next blocking position down the line. The first location for Laycock's main force was protecting the junction where the escape route turned south towards the mountains. By a stroke of luck, on this first day, the Germans hadn't realized what was going on. The thousands of troops retreating from Souda Bay were able to pass through the commandos' holding position. At this stage, the withdrawal was going well. So Laycock pulled back most of his men, leaving about 50 to hold the line a little longer. These commandos were soon joined by men from the 28th Maori Battalion.
This second lieutenant had come up to the company commander and said, "Oh, we'd like to join you and fight." And then the reaction was, "Dear boy, feel free. Positions up there already dug. They got some food, and the Maoris were up for it on the morning of the 28th.
It would soon become an heroic holding action. From first light, the German mountain troops began a ferocious attack, but could not dislodge the combined force of the commandos and Maoris.
They had that warrior blood in them. They were the ideal partners for the Layforce. If there was going to be if you're going to put up a fight, I'm sure that their commander would have thought these are the guys to leave with Layforce, and they proved to be exactly that.
The Germans were held at bay for several valuable hours. And when they finally advanced, they found the Maoris and commandos had slipped away before they could be surrounded, moving back to the rearguard's next holding position. This was at Babili Hani, where Lieutenant Colonel George Young and his men from the Middle East Commandos were already in the thick of the action. The Germans were pounding his position with mortars, artillery, and air attacks. Evelyn Waugh had now experienced 2 days of constant bombardment by the Luftwaffe. He described it as being like German opera. Too long and too loud.
The Germans did a really good job of spotting the commandos' positions. Perhaps this was one of the occasions when, not being trained in conventional tactics, the commandos were at a bit of a disadvantage here. Cam and concealment not quite as good as it should have been.
With George Young's back to the wall, Colonel Robert Laycock decided to join the action, and he was going to do it in style.
And this is where we have the stories of him wearing his peak service dress cap with its red staff officers band round it, really obvious, while everybody else was sort of doing the sensible thing and cowering in the ditches and behind the banks as one would. Laycock was striding around, being every bit the commando leader.
It made him a sitting duck for the German snipers. Even his own men couldn't quite believe it.
You can imagine some of those choice words, that the almost admiring choice words the Australians and the commandos would have been using.
Madness or not, Laycock's bravado worked. The German advance was blocked for the whole day. Then, as they began to circle around his position, Laycock simply ordered his commandos to withdraw once again.
About 2000 hours that night, they set off, and from this point onwards, it was up into the high mountains.
This would be the toughest part of the withdrawal. The 7,000 feet high White Mountains now stood between them and the south coast. In the heat of late May, trekking up the steep mountain tracks with the Germans snapping at their heels was going to be a test, even for the commandos.
The road was not a hard top road, it was a pounded, baking, hard limestone road.
For the thousands of exhausted men the commandos were trying to protect, it was a terrible ordeal.
We walked at night through this very rough ground. Looking back, I just don't know really how we managed it without stumbling and falling flat out and all this sort of thing, but we did. And we just walked. And when the morning came, we found a hen house and perched in there for the day. And we had no food, but I don't recall actually getting terribly hungry, as it were. I was more exhausted than hungry.
Their biggest problem was thirst, because the wells had no windlasses or buckets nearby. Eventually I found an old abandoned truck and I drained some water out of the radiator. It tasted a bit rusty and a bit oily, but at least it was wet.
With the German mountain troops pressing hard on their tail, Laycock's men used every trick they could think of to slow their advance.
They slewed the tanks across the road, drained the oil from them and left the engine running. So that would make a 40-ton chunk of metal blocking the road for the Germans, and it significantly slowed them up.
On the 28th of May, one day after the commandos' arrival, the head of the retreating Allied column had reached the south coast. Many of these exhausted, hungry men took refuge in caves, waiting for the chance to escape from the small village of Sfakia. With some 20,000 people fleeing towards the coast, it was a race against time for General Freiberg, who was now in Sfakia trying to organize the evacuation. At best, he reckoned he had about 4 days before the island would fall. His biggest problem was the Luftwaffe's total command of the air. On the 14-hour journey from Egypt, only the fastest ships in the Royal Navy could run the gauntlet of the German bombers. But these warships weren't troop carriers. They had limited space on board. And even if they made it to Crete, it was still so dangerous they would have to approach the rugged coast in the few hours of darkness each night.
None of us, of course, had seen it. We were to approach it in complete darkness. The enemy would only be a few miles away, and it was a most hazardous operation.
Under these constraints, Freiberg reckoned that over 4 nights, only about 13,000 men could get away. It was up to Freiberg who would go. He took a military decision, giving priority to as many of his fighting troops as possible, leaving behind those who had become stragglers.
Stragglers were people who were coming in without their unit, without weapon, without equipment, and couldn't be married up with their unit.
These men would be left to the mercy of the Germans. But Freiberg had little choice. On the night of the 28th, the first rescue ships arrived, with midshipman Adrian Holloway on board.
We arrived off Sfakia at 0030 and immediately lowered the boats, and they set off to get troops from the beach. The universal cry that went up was, "Thank God for the Navy." They'd all placed immense faith in the fact that the Navy would evacuate them from their terrible time, and they were only thankful to get on board.
New Zealand infantryman Roy Hammond was one of the walking wounded on the list to get away.
It was after dark anyway that night. We set off for the beach. I don't know just how far it was, probably a couple of miles, just on the donkey track. And got down to the beach, and a small landing craft there to take us out to the ships. We left about, I think, about 4 in the morning, something like that.
But even when he had escaped Crete, Roy Hammond still wasn't out of danger.
I think we were bombed 8 times that day, but luckily none of them were close enough to do any harm. And back to Alex and into a hospital.
In that first convoy, just over 1,000 fighting troops and wounded had got away.
When we arrived in Alexandria, ships sounded their sirens, people waved, and we felt we were almost heroes. It was really a very heartening experience after what we had been through.
But as these first evacuees disembarked in Alexandria, there were still some 19,000 other soldiers back on Crete, hoping to follow them to safety. During the next day, the 29th of May, many of them were still 15 miles from the coast, up on the wide plateau in the center of the White Mountains. With this stage of the withdrawal being covered by other troops, the Layforce commandos headed down from the mountains to their next blocking position.
They went down almost certainly the Imbros Gorge, 6 miles very deep, steep-sided gorge where to get a bomb or a bullet into there from the Luftwaffe or a shell from the German army would be a very lucky shot indeed. So it was a really good route to go down.
The exhausted commandos now prepared for a last-ditch defence of the approaches to Sfakia. They dug in on the coastal plateau, just 3 miles from the village. Laycock was now tantalizingly close to the evacuation beach.
Chief amongst his thought was, where are we going to be in the priority of evacuation?
The answer came from General Freiberg at his makeshift headquarters above Sfakia. Layforce was on the list of fighting troops to be evacuated, but only at the very end, expected to be in 3 nights' time. That night, the evacuation went well. 6,000 men made their escape on schedule. The following day, German mountain troops met fierce resistance from Laycock's commandos and their fellow defenders, determined to protect the approach to Sfakia. General Freiberg was still hoping the evacuation would continue as planned. 4 more destroyers, Nizam, Napier, Kelvin, and Kandahar, were on their way to pick up another 3,000 men. But the Luftwaffe had other plans.
Towards tea time, we were attacked by 6 aircraft. And we twisted and turned, as always. Fortunately, our captain managed to evade the bombs. But suddenly, a cry went up, Kandahar's been hit. Then another cry, Kelvin's been hit. They signaled they were going to return to Alexandria. They made a signal saying, "We hate to leave you, may God be with you," but exclamations of goodwill didn't alleviate our fear of having to carry on with just the 2 of the destroyers.
They hadn't just lost 2 ships. They'd also lost valuable evacuation time.
It wasn't until midnight that we got to Sfakia. But this time we could see flashes on the hills above the little harbour. One soldier said to us that the German army was only 4 miles away.
Soon, desperate men were clambering onto the ship.
The mess decks began to be crammed with troops, wolfing down sandwiches of ham and so on, which they hadn't seen, of course, for a very long time.
However, with only 2 ships, the Navy could only take off 1,500 men that night, half the number General Freiberg had planned. But it was no longer his problem. That same evening, he had taken the VIP escape route, laid on by Middle East Command. They couldn't let their general fall into German hands. The next day, the Germans kept the noose tight around Sfakia. In the village, tension was mounting. There were still 9,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers and many stragglers desperate to escape. But by 6:30 that evening, General Weston, the man left in charge of the evacuation, knew for certain this would be the last night. The rescue ships already on their way could only take about 4,000 men. Whatever happened, a huge number of troops would have to be left behind. All Weston could do was stick to the plan. Fighting troops would take priority. Up on the plateau above the village, about 700 Layforce commandos, with Lieutenant Colonel George Young in charge, were holding their defensive position. They still expected to be evacuated. Their orders were to wait until after the New Zealand and Australian units on Weston's list had withdrawn. As Evelyn Waugh recorded,
Weston said that we were to cover the withdrawal and that a message would be sent to us by the embarkation officer on Sfakia Beach when we could retire.
Soon after 11 o'clock that night, the final rescue ships arrived offshore. The New Zealanders were the first to make their escape. As the other units moved down towards the beach, the commandos above the village covered the withdrawal, waiting for their own turn to move. But around midnight, they were still waiting. Laycock and Waugh went to find out what was happening. What they discovered was chaos. On the way to the beach, fighting troops were having to push their way through a mass of stragglers. Even worse, the men who'd been in charge, General Weston and his staff, had just made their escape on another VIP flying boat. With time running out and no one in command, Laycock issued his own orders, sending an urgent message back to his commandos above the village, telling them it was time to go. But most would never make it. When the rescue ships finally reached Alexandria, the legacy of that last chaotic night became clear. Colonel Robert Laycock and Evelyn Waugh had got away. But only 128 other commandos had escaped on those final ships. Over 500 had not made it, including Lieutenant Colonel George Young. In all, out of some 30,000 troops, just over 12,000 had been rescued from Crete's south coast. For those left on the island, a long, painful journey into captivity now lay ahead. Among them, over 3/4 of the commandos Laycock had brought to Crete just 1 week earlier. In the aftermath, many questions were asked. Could the British forces have done better? Had the commandos failed? Had Laycock abandoned his men? Certainly the loss of so many troops was a disaster. But Crete itself had been lost before the commandos even arrived. As a makeshift rearguard, it was felt Layforce had done all that could be expected of them.
They weren't prepared for that sort of operation, and all they could do is to just cover the withdrawal in the stages. Most frustrating operation, but they carried it out with fortitude, guts and courage.
George Young, one of the men who had fought so hard, would spend the rest of the war in the fortress prison of Colditz. But he still considered Laycock's escape to be both justified and required. Certainly Laycock's superiors agreed with Young. Within 2 years, Laycock was promoted and replaced Lord Louis Mountbatten as Churchill's Chief of Combined Operations.